Well, this is a talk about the history of Ashford Hospital. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 created workhouses around the country and formed what had been independent parish workhouses into unions, which created a workhouse for the whole area. And in the case of the Spelthorne area, this was the Staines Union Workhouse, which opened in 1840. And this really was the precursor to Ashford Hospital. It was on the same site. It was for 350 inmates, and the operation was seen by an elected board of guardians, 21 in number, representing all the local communities. The entrance to the workhouse was actually off the London Road. You can see this was the entrance in, and these are all the workhouse buildings here. And this is an old postcard of the entrance to the workhouse from the London Road. You can see the Porter's Lodge on the left and the various main buildings of the workhouse in the background. This would be about 1905. In the 1881 census, the workhouse had 330 inmates, plus the master and the matron, John and Julia Saunders. Their 5 children, one of whom was a schoolmistress, and presumably taught some of the children at the workhouse, a nurse and another teacher. So the rest of the staff were obviously not resident and must have come in from the local area. Here's another postcard of the workhouse buildings, again, probably about 1905, 1910. You'll see that it actually says the Hall, Ashford, and euphemisms such as hall were quite often used on birth and death certificates to avoid the stigma attached at the time to being in the workhouse. Here's another view of the workhouse, and this is just looking across from the crossroads where the traffic lights are today on the London Road. And this is the old Stag and Hounds pub on the corner of Stanwell Road and London Road, which is now the Bulldog. Here's another plan of the workhouse. This one is from slightly later, from 1914. And you can see by this stage a separate boys' home had been added on the right-hand side there. In 1905, there was a rather sad story reported in the local paper that 13-year-old William Davis had escaped from the workhouse 6 times, running back 2 miles to his parents in Ashford Common on the last occasion, naked except for a blanket. And this rather sad end to the report was that he was now in a cell, triple barred and double locked, which is a sad reflection, I'm afraid, on the how people were treated in those days. Here's a shot of the original chapel of the workhouse. And some of the ancillary buildings which survived quite late into the life of the hospital. In fact, this view dates from the 1960s, long after the workhouse had closed. Again, another late survivor from the original workhouse buildings was situated just by where the current entrance into the hospital was. And this was the former workhouse infirmary, which later became the School of Nursing and the library. And obviously sick people from the workhouse were treated here. In 1921, it was again reported in a local paper that Henry Jones had died in Shepperton, aged 74, and incredibly, he'd been a resident of Staines Workhouse for 65 years. The newspaper noted rather disapproving, that he and his brother had cost the ratepayers £2,400 over their lifetimes in their care. But when you hear that they were both deaf mutes, it puts rather a complexion on it. And this was the only care, so-called, that was available to them at the time to put them in the workhouse. On the 1st of April 1930, the workhouse was taken over by Middlesex County Council and renamed the Staines Public Assistance Institution, which hopefully gave it a slightly better feel than the workhouse, which was always treated as such a stigma. And indeed, it is said that the care did improve after the County Council took over from the local board. Now, about this sort of time in the early 20th century, the Staines Joint Isolation Hospital opened, and we can see a sort of artist's impression of it here. It opened in April 1913. It was first planned as early as 1882 by the Joint Hospital Board, but opposed by local ratepayers who voted the board members who proposed it out at the next elections. So work stopped between 1882 and right up until 1900, the site was left vacant. However, in 1901, a smallpox hospital was built on the old foundations, which have been left ever since work stopped by the Staines Rural District Council. By 1910, the Middlesex County Council banged heads together on the local organisations and forced the councils to form a joint hospital board. And then the go-ahead was given for this joint isolation hospital to be built. The hospital originally comprised an administration block, which is the large building here, a lodge, this is on Long Lane, just at the back of the present hospital site, and two separate isolation wards, one for scarlet fever, one for diphtheria, an observation block, and there was various other laundry and disinfecting blocks and that as well. So it was all a sort of self-contained unit on the edge of the present hospital site. Here's a plan of the joint isolation hospital, and you can see Long Lane at the back here. But part of the site was a gravel pit, and they had this sort of sunken garden put into the remains of the old gravel pit. And you can see there were two separate sort of exercise areas for the two isolation blocks here, the smallpox block and the diphtheria block. And they were completely separated off from all the admin and the entrance and exit lodge at the other side. Here's a photograph of the buildings, and this is from the entrance. This is the entrance lodge on the right here, and the administration lodge in the background. The administration block had a doctor's dispensary, a consulting room, a kitchen, a nurse's dining room, and a matron's room on the ground floor, and had 10 bedrooms for the nurses on the first floor and 2 large bedrooms for more senior staff on the second floor. The lodge just had a living room, a bedroom, plus discharging wards to the rear. In other words, the patients who were judged clear of infection would be discharged through that lodge. Here's another photograph showing the two diphtheria and scarlet fever pavilions looking from the admin area. You can see it's all fenced off there. And another shot of one of the pavilions. The diphtheria and scarlet fever pavilions were both identical. They had a female ward on the left with 8 beds and a male ward with 6 beds on the right. And they had one each of private male and female rooms as well. In the centre, there was a nurse's station, an entrance hall, and a bathroom. Here's a picture of the opening of the joint isolation hospital in 1913 with various more senior members of staff gathered together. And just to locate it in relation to the present day hospital, obviously the workhouse at the time, this is from the 1914 Ordnance Survey map, and you can see the workhouse down here where the present hospital is, the boys' home there, and the isolation hospital well away up there. The present cemetery, you can just see there just off the London Road, that's still there, of course. Also in the area and connected in a way to Ashford Hospital later on was the Staines Cottage Hospital, which was raised by an independent charitable trust at the time and opened on the 9th of May 1914. It was actually opened by Lady Clark, who was the wife of Sir Edward Clark, prominent QC who lived in Staines and was responsible for the building of St Peter's Church by the river in Staines. It was extended in 1927, but in 1950 it became the gynecological annexed to Ashford Hospital. This was after the NHS had been created and Ashford became a county hospital. In 1975, it became the geriatric unit, but it was closed in 1980 and subsequently demolished, and it's now the Fairmead Centre for adults with learning difficulties. Now we're back again to the plan of what was by then had become the Staines Public Assistance Institution, as you see under Middlesex County Council. This is from the 1934 Ordnance Survey map, and the boys' home to the right here had by then become a separate nurses' home, but all the workhouse buildings were substantially still intact at that time. Now, the big change on the workhouse site was that the Staines Emergency Hospital was founded on the 2nd of September 1939. This was obviously at the outbreak of the Second World War, and this was very much in the expectation that there were going to be huge casualties from bombing in the London area when the war broke out after the Spanish Civil War and the bombing of Guernica, etc. There was a huge fear that there were going to be mass civilian casualties if any war broke out. So a chain of emergency hospitals was established all around the London area, but outside the central area they thought could well be devastated. So Ashford was one of these hospitals, and it was founded as a whole series of single-storey huts, really. The first block built was called the C block, and it was built on what had been a potato field, and the staff were transplanted from existing hospitals. In the case of the Staines Emergency Hospital, it was the West Middlesex and St George's hospitals, and the initial staff was one matron, one medical director, 12 sisters, 12 nurses and one steward. In fact, as you all know, at the start of the war, the mass bombing didn't actually develop, and in fact the first patients the hospital took were wounded from Dunkirk, some of whom are see here. This was in May to June 1940 when the British Expeditionary Force was evacuated Dunkirk, and obviously a lot of wounded were brought up by train to this area. At this time, Queen Elizabeth, later of course the Queen Mother, visited the hospital on the 19th of June 1940. And I think she also visited St Peter's Hospital at Chertsey at the same time, which is obviously now linked with Ashford Hospital. And here's the visitors book from the Staines Emergency Hospital as it was then, and you can see here the signature of the Queen, Elizabeth R, June the 19th, 1940, when she came to visit. After the Second World War, the bombing unfortunately in the area hadn't affected the hospital too much. The C wards, C2 and C10, were damaged, and the stores depot was demolished. But fortunately, the hospital largely came through the war unscathed. In the meantime, since the C blocks had been built, an extra block of wards called the D blocks had also been built. So the hospital had reached quite a considerable size by the end of the war. Just after the war, it actually became the Ashford County Hospital, as you can see it's called here. And this is the main entrance, which was still in the London Road at that time. The hospital now had 648 beds, an operating theatre, an X-ray department, a physio department, and a small outpatients department. Now, on the 5th of July 1948, of course, the National Health Service was founded, and the hospital became obviously part of the NHS, and the name changed slightly now to become Ashford General Hospital. I should mention that the name had changed from being Staines Emergency Hospital to Ashford County Hospital and Ashford General Hospital because, as will be apparent where the hospital is today, it's not really in Staines. It was quite confusing. If you went to the hospital by train, you'd get out at the wrong station if you got out at Staines. So they realigned the name to Ashford, which had a nearer station, although of course technically The hospital is actually in Stanwell, but Stanwell doesn't have a station, hence the reason really why it's called Ashford. By now, the hospital had 711 beds, and this picture here is actually the NHS reserves. Obviously, there was still a civil defence requirement after the war, just in case. I mean, we were still in the period of the Cold War. There was still a requirement for training to see if war actually broke out again, and this is NHS reserves training, as you see here, with all the tin hats on. Now here's a typical ward, probably about 1960. This is one of these single-story wards. They were heated by stoves, coke-fired stoves. You can see the chimney leading up from it there. But each ward had 3 of these stoves down the centre of the ward, which needed stoking every 6 hours, day and night, to keep them going. There's a nice polished linoleum floor there, the local product from the Staines Linoleum Company. 36 beds to a ward, with a ward sister, a staff nurse, 2 state enrolled nurses, 3 to 4 student nurses, and 2 domestic staff. The hospital now was down to 563 beds, but as you'll see from the beds, they were very closely spaced, and there were no curtains in between to give any privacy. Here's the hospital plan about this time. This is 1963 now, and you can see the C blocks here with the central spine corridor running down, and the D blocks with the corridor running down the edge of them there. At this stage, most of the old workhouse buildings were still intact. This is the actual workhouse here, and the infirmary building, which, as I mentioned earlier, was later the nurses' training centre, surviving there. Now, by this time, the entrance had been changed. The main entrance had been changed from where it was on the London Road there, round to Town Lane on this side. And of course, that's where the hospital entrance is today. That opened in 1961. Now, here's some of the workshop built, the workhouse buildings, the main part of it being demolished in 1964 to make way for new hospital buildings, in this case the A&E department and the outpatients, although as we've heard earlier they retained the former infirmary and the chapel. And new facilities such as a nurses' home were opened. This is William House, opened in December 1956. It was named after the then matron, who'd been matron since 1946. It had 77 single bedrooms and 12 bed sitting rooms, which were for sisters. And to give you an idea of what they look like inside, this is the Lang House nurses' home, and this is a lounge within the nursing home in the nurses' home in the 1960s. Grand piano at the back there, very smart. And this is the sort of conditions in which nurses were taught, very reminiscent of schools of the era, with the individual sloping desks there. This would be in the 1960s, class of student nurses. Obviously having the uses of different medical instruments explained to them here. And in this shot, it looks like they're practicing various things such as bandaging and nursing children there. A bit of practical training going on. I mentioned earlier on about these corridors that linked the C and D wards together. Originally, these were open-sided, but they were later bricked in. And again, you can see they're floored in very shiny linoleum there. There were 10 wards in the C block and 8 wards in the D block. This is the children's ward in D5, one of the D blocks, obviously, and it was created when the chronic and geriatric female wards were moved to the site of the old isolation hospital after that closed. And again, you can see the old iron bedsteads quite closely spaced together with no particular privacy, although at least some plain play equipment was provided for the children, but you can see an old wooden boarded floor there. Linoleum was used quite extensively in hospitals because it was supposed to have sort of antiseptic properties. So you saw it very widely used in medical establishments. Now here's meal time on the ward in the 1960s. The trolleys were obviously distributed around to the individual wards, much as they are now. And here's a train of these trolleys being distributed from the central kitchen. Actually, there's nothing new about outsourcing either, because a private catering firm took over the catering at the hospital in 1961-62. The League of Friends began in 1962, and they were originally known as Shrimps because they had these pink uniforms. They operated a trolley service and a shop, and you can see the later incarnation of the shop here in the outpatients department. They later took over the Atrium Cafe in the more recent hospital, and they also ran a tea bar in the West Wing, which of course is no longer there. We'll mention that later on. They also took part in fundraising events for the hospital, including a summer fete, and the shop is now on the ground floor next to X-ray. Now, we saw buildings being demolished earlier on in 1964, and this is what they built on the site. This is the new accident and emergency department, which is this is in 1966, and outpatients was on the first floor at the time. The hospital now had 502 beds, and a new physiotherapy department also opened in 1967. Now, adjacent to the new A&E block was this, which was originally opened as the maternity wing, later known as the West Wing. This opened in 1968. It had 92 beds and 18 intensive care cots, and this was over to the Town Lane side of the site, on the corner really of the London Road and Town Lane, right where the workhouse buildings had been. But there was still need for more modern accommodation for the various departments. And this slide shows preparing the ground for the new clinical block in 1962. And you can see all the single-storey old wards in the background there, which was still in use very much at this time. The hospital now came under the North Surrey District Health Authority, a change in organisation within the NHS. Here's another shot of the clinical block, actually under construction now in 1974. Obviously, construction well advanced there. And a site plan in 1981. By this time, most of the workhouse buildings had been demolished, and you can see the new maternity and A&E blocks which had been built. Some of the workhouse buildings still survive, the laundry, the finance department, and the nurses training school, of course, which is the old infirmary, and the chapel as well still survived down here. But other than that, all the C and D wards were still very much in place, all these single-storey wards, and of course the old isolation hospital was being used. In this case, it took some of the psychogeriatric patients from the Holloway Sanatorium when that closed, and you can see there's also the nurses accommodation up here as well, Lang House and McWilliam House that we saw earlier on. Of course, the ambulance station there in Long Lane as well. Now, in the 1980s, there were various plans to amalgamate local hospitals, and there were a lot of protests locally. This is actually in Church Road in Ashford against closure plans. It was planned for a while to build a new hospital in Hounslow to replace both Ashford and the West Middlesex hospitals, but these plans were later abandoned in 1991, and so Ashford Hospital stayed on its current site. But the hospital was still very much in need of modernisation. Some of the single-storey wards still survived. This is the admin block, as you see, which was still occupying some of the blocks which dated from the Second World War. All this area was selected for redevelopment. You can see the old workhouse chapel, which was survived from that point as well. This was the early 1990s. The Vicar of Stanwell originally served as the hospital chaplain, but as we've heard, the chapel was later demolished to make way for a later development, although of course a chapel has subsequently been provided in the more modern buildings. Now, there were great plans to redevelop the hospital, to modernise it, and this is a model of the new hospital in the 1990s. And Ashford and St Peter's NHS Trust was formed in 1992, and to help finance the redevelopment, 10 acres of the site on this side was sold to Tesco's for their superstore and petrol station. Occupied a lot of the site of the old car park, but of course a lot of the old C&D wards were on this site, and the hospital was really concentrated on the southern part of the site. So a new ward block was built, an education centre, management offices, etc. An enlarged and updated accident and emergency department, a main kitchen and a restaurant were all completed in 1995, and the new hospital became operational in September of that year. Here's the opening of the new A&E department in 1994. And this is what the hospital looks like today. In 2006, the A&E department was closed at Ashford, and it was transferred with other services to St Peter's Hospital at Chertsey. It was replaced by a walk-in centre. In 2007, the West Wing, the old maternity wing, was closed, and large apartment blocks were built on the site, which opened in January 2016. But on the site now are Chaucer, Dickens and Wordsworth wards in the main block. Outpatients has been refurbished, and in 2013 the Jasmine Suite for breast and gynecological outpatients was opened. So over all those years since 1840, when the workhouse opened, there's been quite a transformation of healthcare on the site, from the early days of the workhouse infirmary through the days of the isolation hospital, the wartime hospital, and now up to a modern local hospital. So I hope that's given you a good impression anyway of the history of Ashford Hospital. Okay,